How we begin to place carp and carp fishing into the world at large depends to a large extent on how we view the world around us. For most of us, most of the time, the world in which we live is largely static. It doesn't change. Not really. Yes, there are seasons, and animals migrate or hibernate, and trees shed their leaves or don't lose their needles. But for the most part, the world around us is a constant, something that only changes during the most exceptional of times. This is in no small part due to the fact that humans live on a different time scale than the ecosystems around us. The longest-lived humans walk this earth for little more than a century. Most of us experience the world for decades less. An ecosystem is comprised of multiple species, a community or more comprised of thousands of different organisms which all experience life on different timescales. From flies whose lives are measured in days, to trees that can live for thousands of years. As a consequence, the ecosystem can only truly be viewed and understood from a long-term way of thinking about the world. As a consequence of our seemingly out-of-sync time frame with which we view the world, society often exhibits something known as a shifting baseline. As defined by Soga and Gaston in their 2017 paper, Shifting Baseline Syndrome, Causes, Consequences, and Implications. A shifting baseline is, quote, a gradual change in the accepted norms for the condition of a natural environment due to a lack of human experience, memory, and or knowledge of its past condition, end quote. For us in the Pacific Northwest, that may be that what we would consider a good salmon run would have been considered pitiful in the past due to overall environmental pressures faced by salmon in their environment from human activity. It may be viewing the Columbia River as a large, silent, deep body of water rather than a relatively shallow, less calm river which it was before the dams. It may also be, as I have seen some people saying online and in person, confusing naturalized species such as bass and carp as being naturally occurring. Even without the effects of shifting baseline syndrome, the way in which we view the ecosystems around us are far from uniform. Our view is colored and skewed by personal experiences, prejudices, and preferences which impact the way in which we, as a society, value and manage the world around us. This often leads to varying levels of success among conservation tactics as well as environmental restoration efforts. There are a few high-profile examples of species which wreak havoc in novel ecosystems into which they're introduced. Cane toads, zebra mussels, and snakeheads are but a few examples. There are campaigns of control waged against them by government agencies, everything from government-sanctioned exterminations to sponsored sporting events aimed at culling unwanted populations. Some campaigns to save the environment from detrimental effects are more controversial than others. In Australia, where the extremely detrimental effects of the domestic cat have hit harder than any other continent, government-sanctioned culling has met with negative reactions online. In the Pacific Northwest, early closure of the 2021 steelhead season in Washington state was met with calls for boycotts and outright racist remarks regarding the indigenous fishing rights, similar to when bass, walleye, and catfish were considered being put on the WDFW's invasive species list. It is ironic that a public that so willingly would see the eradication of carp or the bullfrog would fight for non-natives which, like the domestic cat, are so much demonstrably worse. Of course, the cause for such favoritism among non-natives is not hidden very far beneath the surface. Cats are cute. Everyone loves them, and if you don't, the internet will descend upon you like angry hornets. Bass, non-native predators which are voracious and will eat whatever fits in their mouth, are often not only tolerated but celebrated due to their popularity as a sport fish, which sells not only fishing licenses, but tackle, baits, boats, sonar, and other high-end gadgets. Carp, as a point of comparison, are often neglected, accused of damaging bass beds, seem to have no food or game value and are demonized and are thus targeted for removal. In Moses Lake, for example, there is a push to eliminate carp. There is even an annual bow fishing contest, which I will address in its own segment later, which was started by a bass fisherman for protecting populations of non-native largemouth bass in Moses Lake. Many places I fish for carp are not natural, or are no longer in their natural state. The Potholes Reservoir, which feeds into Moses Lake proper, is a direct result of the O'Sullivan Dam and the Columbian Basin Irrigation Project, as are the Pothole Seeps Lakes, which scatter the Potholes State Park. Local ponds around Yakima are the result of gravel pits. The Columbia River has been so dammed that it no longer resembles the raging river it once was. To change or not to change, that is the question. Do we accept the shifting baseline and cut our losses, or do we hard stop the change and reverse as fast as possible? Current zeitgeist would seem to sit somewhere, uncomfortably, in the middle ground where we so desperately want to save our keystone species, such as salmonids, yet we don't want to lose out on the benefits of the more productive non-natives. I'm looking at you, bass. We also don't want to discourage use of the natural resources around us, even though it's clear that such use often brings about detrimental impacts to the environment that put even more pressure on indigenous organisms. In eastern Washington, where the water bodies are more directly tied to human activity, namely irrigation, than water bodies in western Washington, and where the ponds are often too shallow and too warm to sustain a robust salmonid population, it makes sense to allow non-natives to populate and survive in microhabitats where native species may not thrive. In cases of gravel pits, or bodies of water created through irrigation altering the water table, one could argue whether even the native species ought to be there. To understand further, and move closer to our ultimate goal of discussion of the common carp itself, we have to first understand the differences between non-native, naturalized, and invasive species.